This is the world's most advanced sample coffee roaster. It's called the ROEST. It's called the ROEST L200 Ultra. And when you think of a coffee roaster, this may not actually be what you're thinking of. You may be thinking of those very large industrial machines that you would see in a commercial coffee roastery, and not something at all this size, which is more in the size of a larger home espresso machine. A coffee roaster like this takes a very specific niche in a coffee roastery workflow, or serves a very specific purpose for home coffee roasters. Now, we are hundreds of roasts in on this thing, and in today's video, we're going to look under the hood, take a look at what it has going on. I'm going to hopefully help you figure out if this is something you should or shouldn't be considering, and I'm going to be sharing my unfiltered experience with it so far. Now, if you've been following the channel for any length of time, you know that Sarah and I, we have a lot of experience as home coffee enthusiasts. We've tried all kinds of coffees, some of the nicest coffees from all around the world, used all sorts of brewing equipment. We are relatively new to the world of coffee roasting. We've been into this about 6 months now. Now, that being said, I am the type of person that I get sucked way down the rabbit hole on stuff. I love to learn. I love picking up new stuff. And because I'm so excited about coffee, I have been all in learning from a fire hose on this stuff over that period of time, but still relatively new. So you are going to be getting the take of an avid learner who is fired up about coffee and relatively new to roasting on this thing. But even if you are a super experienced coffee roaster, I think you're going to find the look under the hood on this thing helpful, as well as some of the feedback that I have about it after using it. This L200 Ultra was sent to us by the ROEST team. We connected with them at the SCA Expo in Texas in April of 2025, met up with them via a mutual friend, and they had seen our channel. They were excited about the roastery project that we had going on, and they sent us one of these units. Now, they don't get to preview this video. They're seeing my thoughts at the same time as you are. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts on this specific roaster, we need to first look at what actually is a sample roaster and what does it actually play in the wider context of coffee roasting. Well, first, most people who get into roasting end up starting on a sample roaster. And that's because they're smaller, there's a lot less waste, they are less expensive than commercial roasters. And from a purely practical standpoint, most people do not actually have the capital or the infrastructure to put a commercial roaster in their own home, which is where a lot of us start with this stuff. Now, for people who want to roast their own coffee at home and they're not trying to grow a coffee roastery on any kind of commercial scale, very often a sample roaster can fully and completely fill that void and do enough volume for them to enjoy a variety of coffees on a daily basis. And you do see sort of higher end home coffee roasting enthusiasts picking up these types of units. Now, do you have to pick up something like this in order to do a good job of roasting coffee? No, there are a lot of other sample roasters that come in at a lower price point than this, maybe not as feature rich, but can absolutely roast really good coffee. We will get into the advantages of this over some of those other units in a bit. Now, when it comes to commercial roasteries, which is something that we're trying to grow with our roastery project, Got Coffee Co., sample roasters play a very specific role. When a coffee roaster is choosing the coffees that they are going to put on their menu, they can either request or they get sent little tiny samples of coffee by either coffee importers or sometimes directly by coffee producers. When roasters receive those samples, they will roast it on the sample roasters and then use that roast to decide whether or not they want to spend, in some cases, actually a very large amount of money buying a shipment of a specific coffee. So when you're running a business, you're using these things to make some very high stakes financial decisions, which is why some roasters go to the nines and pick up a top of the line unit like this. Now, there are some other advantages in a commercial space that the ROEST platform affords, such as having multiple roasters in different locations, being able to produce consistent results. You see some importers using them at origin and at receiving facilities to make sure that everything is aligned from a profile standpoint. But in the commercial space, sample roasters are most often used to make the decision on which coffees you're going to buy. And then in some cases, you can use them to develop a roast profile for a specific coffee without wasting a ton of green coffee in your larger production roaster, which is how a lot of the people who end up with these things end up justifying the very high price tag. You know, these are very expensive pieces of equipment, definitely commercial grade. The Ultra comes in at 8,490 euros, and that's not including shipping or import, which can vary depending on where you are in the world. You know, it's a lot. It's a lot to invest in a piece of equipment, but you are filtering a lot of decisions from a business standpoint through it. Now, there are some home roasters who just think, I want the top of the line, and they jump in there too. And you might think at that price point, it actually does everything that you could dream of perfectly. And it is very good. It's loaded with all kinds of crazy stuff in here to tune your roasts at a very high degree of precision. But it's not perfect. I always say no product is perfect. There are always compromises. And after using this thing for a bit, I have my things that I wish about it too. And we will come back to some of those things. Now, the ROEST roasters are hybrid coffee roasters. And that means they take elements of drum roasters. And those are roasters that heat the drum directly and use the drum to transfer the heat to the beans. That is called conductive heat, as well as air roasters. And those are roasters which use air to pump heat into the beans. That's called convective heat. These roasters are hybrid because they heat with air, but they also use a drum to agitate and move the beans inside the roaster. So it's a little bit of a hybrid approach there. As far as sample roasters go, it can handle a fairly large volume at 200 grams, but it is capped at that, and we will come back to that. Let's turn it on though first before we roast some coffee here. Now, where these roasters set themselves apart from a lot of their peers is with data, precision, and consistency. They are loaded so full of sensors and software that you can get in there and like tweak absolutely any aspect of your coffee roast to get exactly the result that you want. And it will do that consistently, you know, day to day, week to week. And if there's even any changes as a result of like atmospheric pressure or local temperature or anything like that, you can see it on here. Now, inside this thing, most sample roasters will have at least one temperature sensor. This one has 6. One for air temperature, that's the temperature of the air inside the drum here. One sensor to measure the actual drum temperature, so what is the temperature of the surface of the drum that's rotating around in there. There is a sensor to measure the temperature of the exhaust that is coming out. There is a sensor to measure the temperature of the air at the inlet where the air comes into the roaster. And there is a bean temperature sensor to actually measure the temperature of the beans. And it's sticking kind of right in where the beans will be rotating around in there. Now, that's only 5 sensors, and that's because the 6th one is a second bean temperature sensor. And that gets used when the drum is rotating in the opposite direction, something they call counterflow mode. And the reason why they put that second bean temperature sensor in there is because when the drum is rotating in the opposite direction, the beans are sitting in a slightly different spot inside the drum, and they wanted to make sure that they had the same positioning for both rotations. So 2 bean temperature sensors in there. There is also a air pressure sensor to measure the air pressure inside the drum while you're roasting. You can see it on a graph while you're roasting, as well as something called first crack detection. First crack is a stage in coffee roasting where when the beans get to a certain temperature, they'll actually start to crack. And you use that to mark the start of what's called the development stage of roasting. And when that starts to happen, the beans will actually pop, like you can hear them. And the first crack detection inside here actually listens for those pops. You set it to listen for a certain number of pops above a certain temperature threshold, and then it will automatically mark the start of the development phase. You can do it manually too, but if you have it set to automate in that way, you can also have it drop the beans at a certain amount of time in different ways after the development phase starts. So a fully automated roast from drop will do that in a second, or you can do it manually as well. There's also 2 fans in here, one for the air coming in and one for the air going out, as well as drum RPM control in addition to direction control. So they're literally taking like any variable that could be impacting your coffee coffee roast and giving you as the roaster control over those variables. It also comes with ventilation hardware, you know, a hose, or they have this little elbow that you can use to ventilate it if you want. 2 different size cooling trays, one standard and one to do larger batches up to 200 grams, a chaff collection drawer which slides out of here, a upsized hopper up here for doing, again, up to 200 gram roasts, a trier, which is something that actually pulls out of the front and lets you inspect and sniff the beans as part of the roasting process if you want to do that. A couple spare parts, some nifty bean trays, and my favorite, their little cupping spoon. I love that they include that. Now, at this point, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, okay, wow, this is a lot. I don't really know how to take all of that and leverage all of that information to make my roasts better. It sounds actually pretty difficult to use. So if I'm just getting started, am I even going to be able to jump in and make sense of this thing? So I thought, you know, as a new user, I'm just going to dive in and try and do this and actually see how difficult it really is. So I didn't read the manual. I took it out of the box. I put it in front of our window back there. I had read up on some of the features, like the first crack detection. So I went into the menu and I actually figured out how to set that the way that I wanted. And then I just left it more or less on the default settings. And I thought, let's put some beans in and see what happens. So that's exactly what I did. I took some beans that I had, I put them in the hopper. Oh, I spilled a couple there, and I pulled this little thing up and I just left it to see what would happen. You know, I watched the little screen here as the roast progressed, and it was all very easy, very intuitive. I was expecting it to be really complicated, big learning curve, but just to throw beans in there and get started, it was doable without even reading the manual. So that was fantastic. Now, when I got to designing my own profiles and trying to adapt things for different beans, yeah, that's where you get into definitely higher learning curve, a lot more flexibility, a lot more ability to control things. And that's where I started to feel like, okay, the barrier at this point is me. I need to figure out how to use this thing to get the results that I want. Now, the good news is that the roaster wasn't standing in the way. It was giving me 100% consistency, responding in predictable ways, which is exactly what you would hope for. Now, as I said, being several hundred roasts into this thing, there are a couple things that I wish it did that it doesn't currently do. There are a couple things that I want to take a quick look at here before we get into that. And the first one is Counterflow Mode. And that's the mode where the drum will rotate in reverse. Now, you might ask, why do I actually care about that? And it's a fair question. And the reason why is because when the drum rotates in reverse, it actually moves the beans closer to that air inlet where the air is a little bit hotter. And when the drum is rotating that way, you can use that operating mode to achieve 2 different outcomes. One is roasting the beans more quickly. So if you need to up your volume, you can do it that way. And the second way that people tend to use that feature to roast in a similar time actually to standard mode, just at a lower inlet temperature. So you're roasting in a gentler manner, which is going to help bring out some more nuance, especially with some delicate flavor notes. In theory, anyway. Now, I'm still dialing in my Counterflow profiles to get the results I want on the coffees I'm working with right now, but it is a very cool feature and a way of kind of radically changing the way that the roaster operates to achieve a different outcome. Also, there are different types of profile that the roaster can run. You can think of them as like modes of operation. One type is called an air temperature profile, where basically you chart a curve that tells the roaster what the air temperature inside the roaster is supposed to be, and it will use power to try and match that curve. There are bean temperature profiles where you set the curve of the bean temperature that you want to achieve over the course of the roast. That's by time. And it will kind of do the same thing, adjust the power and the inlet temperature to try and get the roaster to match that desired bean temperature. There are inlet temperature profiles where you set a specific trajectory for the air inlet temperature over time. And then there are power profiles where you can set a certain power level over time to the roaster. Now, beyond that, there are a couple combo profiles. One is called a power/bean temperature profile, where it will adjust the power over the course of the roast, but not specifically by time. It will actually adjust that power level based on changes in bean temperature thresholds. And then the last one is called bean temperature/inlet temperature profiles. And it's doing a similar thing there where it's adjusting the inlet temperature based on certain bean temperature thresholds. And for a lot of roast power users, what I'm seeing out there anyways is a lot of them are using that type of profile because it provides a very high degree of control and consistency within the roasting environment. Now, also I'll say when it comes to pure bean temperature profiles, I did try them, but in my experience, there's a bit of a lag and kind of an overcorrection that can happen when you're trying to run that type of profile. Doesn't mean they can't work, it just means you get a little bit of this. Now, feature set aside and sort of general things that the roaster can do and sensors that it has and all of that, what are my personal likes and dislikes when it comes to this specific roaster? Well, there's a lot that I like, actually. The automation, you not only get all of these data points and ability to hone and tune and sequentially improve. Oh, there we go. Now we're going to leave that on there just to cool. The fan will kind of suck air down through these beans and send it out the exhaust, and it will turn off when the cooling cycle is finished. But great example of automation. You know, if you want, you can jump in. If you don't want to have to babysit this thing, you can toss beans in, even walk away from the roaster totally and come back knowing that it's going to be very close to what you wanted to come out of it. And that was a big surprise for me. I'm just going to turn this thing off now. You know, getting into coffee roasting, it's very, very intimidating, you know, and I wasn't sure that it was going to go well, especially with very little experience, but being able to throw beans in and rely on the roaster to do exactly what you would hope, which is roast coffee that tastes very good. It was almost shocking how happy we were that were our very first roasts that came out of this thing. Now, we had done our due diligence on sourcing and all that, so it was good coffee, but to have the roaster just deliver a great result, I like that a lot. Anything in coffee that just works immediately makes me a fan. One of the things that I actually really loved about this wasn't actually part of the roaster itself. It was actually the online web portal that Roest calls it Roast Connect. And when you get in there, you know, you can see what the roaster is doing in real time. That's pretty cool. It will draw the lines on the screen while you're roasting. Also cool. You can design your roast profiles on there, which is great, but it also is kind of like this integrated roastery software. You put in whatever beans that you have and it will subtract them from the inventory as you're roasting them. So you always have a handle on what your inventory levels are. It's got a cupping feature where you can select different roasts for cupping and it will load the cupping form into the software. Very, very cool. I actually think they undersell that software a little bit because it really is seamless, easy to use, and nice. You can export your roasting logs, bring them into CSVs, do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. The taste, as I mentioned, is great. I've been very happy with the tastes that come out basically across the board when I'm using this roaster. And the fact that I don't need to open a manual or documentation to make heads or tails of the menu is a huge win for me. You know, I love obsessing over user experience, whether it's a piece of pour over equipment or a very complicated piece of equipment like this. I really like it when I can turn it on, go through the menu and make heads or tails of anything that I need to. And this somehow, with all that complexity, achieves that. Now, the software does take some of that load off in terms of programming profiles and all that kind of thing, but just as a package, it is very easy to use and easy to access even advanced features. You know, sometimes I'll pull a bonehead move when I'm roasting and do something wrong or whatever and ruin a batch, but it's usually me, not the roaster, when that happens. So it's nice when the equipment doesn't get in the way, at least. It has something called a between batch profile, which is really nice. And what that is when it drops the coffee like that, it will enter kind of like a mini program in between roasts, which will bring the drum, the interior environment of the drum, to the right equilibrium for you to start the next roast. So by the time you've done your logging, your weighing, your color measurement, anything like that, and go back to your roaster, it's going to be ready to go, ready for you to put in the next roast. Also, it's really easy to open up and clean and get in there and service anything if you need to do that. So I like that a lot. And manufacturing and sustainability is something that I always ask about when I'm doing these reviews, and the ROEST team is very thoughtful about that as well, which I like. These are made in Norway, so when it comes to labor standards, there's a certain minimum bar that exists there. There are a lot of circuitry components in here when you open it up, some of which I recognize. There's a Raspberry Pi in there that they use as a part of the circuitry inside. It's not a dessert, it's actually a kind of a mini computer, and I was surprised to learn actually that those are manufactured in the UK. There also is a larger PCB that is made specifically for ROEST, and it is actually manufactured in Norway. The fans in there are made in Austria, but there are some other components that are currently made in either India or China. And as they grow, the ROEST team is working to bring more and more of their production kind of closer to home base within Europe. You know, when I ask companies about this stuff, a lot of them sort of kind of give me a bit of an evasive answer about their labor and environmental standards. When I asked the ROEST team about this, they were almost excited that I had asked and eager to give me their response and how they were approaching this. So I really like that when a company is paying attention to their manufacturing labor and environmental footprint. So that's also good. Now, what are the things that I don't love as much, or maybe I struggle with a little bit? Some of them are a little maybe petty and minor. They include dark mode on this, which I love dark mode. Give me all the dark mode all day. The thing with dark mode on this roaster is that every time you turn it off, it forgets that it was in dark mode.
Please, no! No! No!
So when you turn it on again, it's not going to be in dark mode. You have to go into the settings, go into display, and put dark mode on it again. I wish that it could just remember that and just stay in dark mode all the time. Again, like I said, minor thing. Some other things are a little bit more technical. We currently use this roaster, if you can believe it or not, for production. You know, we're keeping our scale small and kind of expanding it as we go. So we've put in some very long days on this thing, and it actually performed really well. Early on, we did burn out one heating element and got on with the ROEST support team. They were fantastic. There's a little fuse on the heating element, and it was actually sitting right over an exhaust line, which caused it to get too hot and it burned out. Anyway, long story short, they had a new one to me in like 2 days, replaced it, changed the position of that wire, no issues since. Even with those very long production days. You know, the most I've ever roasted on this thing in one day is actually about 10 kilos. So, you know, do the math. It was about 50 roasts. It took a long time. You can do it. That's green coffee though, 10 kilos green coffee. Now, I did find that when I am doing production with this thing, I don't love using the first crack detection. Here's why. And if I'm crazy here, let me know. And I think this could actually be changed with firmware. The first crack detection works by listening for the cracks in the coffee beans. You know, it will start listening at a certain temperature, and then once it hears, say, 3 cracks, 5 cracks above that temperature, it will mark first crack and start the development phase, which can be followed by an automatic drop. And when you're doing sample roasts of a lot of different coffees and you just want to get it close enough to get a really good evaluation of a given coffee, that can be very helpful automation, especially if you have a lot going on in a roastery. When you're doing production, you want hyper consistency roast to roast, like perfect. And the issue is that with batches this small, the beans inside may not all crack at exactly the same time. It could be, you know, a little bit later on this roast, a little bit earlier on this roast, depending on the specific beans that are inside that small batch. Now, in larger batches, it tends to all come out in the wash a little bit more, but it can vary a little bit in these small batch sizes. So I found that when I was using first crack detection on production, you know, roast to roast, I was getting slightly different results. What I started doing instead was marking first crack by what I had identified as like an average temperature based on when the beans seem to crack across several roasts. And then I would use that temperature as my first crack point, to which I got perfectly consistent results throughout a whole roast day and subsequent days, actually, when it came to moisture loss and color. The problem is you can't do that automatically. You can't set that as a trigger for first crack within the automation. It has to use the sound. I would love to be able to automate that so that I could do production roasts. I know they're small, but production roasts on this thing, automated, where first crack is triggered by reaching a certain bean temperature set point. Maybe my use case is too narrow for that. I know I won't be using this on production forever, but when I get a really nice Gesha, I only have a few kilos of it, maybe I will actually use this for production. Also, a couple things in the Connect software. It would be nice to be able to advance stages within that online web portal so I could completely control the roaster via the web interface. I don't know how complicated that is, but that would be a nice add at some point in the future. And lastly, depending on what bean you're using, you may find that 200 gram capacity is sort of pushing the limit. Not all beans are equal density. You can get beans that are very high density, so 200 grams takes up a smaller space physically. Less dense beans will take up more volume for the same weight. And not only that, but they actually puff up and actually get a little bit bigger as you're roasting them. So I would find when I would do a lower density bean at that 200 gram batch size, later in the batch, especially, some beans in standard rotation mode would get stuck up here in the exhaust port. Occasionally I would get like a paddle stall as well. There are things that you can do. You can lower the RPM to try and kind of get more of a balance there. But I found for lower density beans that I ended up being around 180 grams for more of like a safe batch size with fewer accommodations made. Now, big disclaimer on that, Counterflow does offer a solution because the drum is turning in the opposite direction and the beans don't get jammed up there in the same way. But if you are running standard profiles, you are going to run into that issue. And this isn't really a negative, but it is, I will say, a consideration. If you get one of these things, you got to figure out how you're going to ventilate it. Running the back of it, I've got it here just piping into my house here, which is not great. It's okay for one roast, but you don't want to be doing that on a regular basis. You got to figure out where you're going to ventilate it, how you're going to run it out the window, or hire an HVAC person in to ventilate it with a more permanent solution. If you're in a setup where ventilation is actually a little bit more difficult, there is a new product called the DI Fluid or Dye Fluid Airwave, which can kind of filter some of that exhaust coming out, but it is something that you'll need to think about. Now, I feel like I could just keep talking, like this is really complicated stuff. So I feel like this video could just keep going on and on, but I think I'm going to park it there. If you have a specific question about this roaster, you got some of my pluses, you got some of my negatives about it, let me know down there in the comments. As we look ahead to the future of our roastery, we are always going to have a sample roaster as a part of our workflow. This one is top of the line. And it really is an excellent sample roaster. When I'm in there tuning variables, trying things, I try and only change one thing at a time. But when I change that thing, I know that the roaster is going to do it the way that I asked it to do. And I know that the result that comes out is going to be reflective of the change that I made. I'm not going to be left wondering, was it warmer in my house, or, did something change that it wasn't supposed to be? If I'm monitoring all those variables correctly, that degree of confidence in the roasts that are coming out is very high. Now, one thing that roasters have always struggled with is taking the very high results that they're able to get with their sample roasters and scaling that up to a production roaster. Everybody says they can kind of figure out how to do that, and the roasting community has kind of come to the conclusion that, this isn't really possible. Your production roast is going to have some sacrifices. It's really difficult to adapt a profile into a production setting. Larger volumes, more air, different type of heat. It's all very complex. And it's a big challenge when it comes to roaster workflow. Now, at this point, it's just words on paper, but the ROEST team is working on taking profiles that are developed on their sample roasters and using an algorithm to scale them up into their P3000 sample roaster. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that or not, but if they can, that will be a big feature for commercial roasters. So a lot of directions that we could go in terms of content when it comes to this and coffee roasting in general. general. So please do make sure you drop what you want to hear from me or any questions that you have down there in the comments, be it about our roasting journey in general or the equipment specifically. We're definitely going to be revisiting this a lot on the channel. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.